Hello guys, welcome back. Please consider leaving a like on the video and a comment so that YouTube can promote the channel more. And don't forget to subscribe. Let's get started. I was 12 years old when I spent the night at my friend Lucas's house. We were very close and used to sleep over at his place frequently. That night, Lucas's parents were out, and we had the whole house to ourselves. It was a cozy house with a basement that always gave me chills, although I never admitted this to Lucas. The basement was dark, with a wooden staircase that creaked with every step, and a musty smell that permeated the air. The walls of the house were decorated with photos of Lucas's family, creating an atmosphere of normality and security that made the feeling of fear even more contradictory. We spent the afternoon playing video games, and at night we decided to watch a horror movie in the living room. The lights were off except for the TV screen. The silence of the house, broken only by the dialogues and sound effects of the movie, seemed amplified by the absence of Lucas's parents. With every unusual noise, we exchanged glances, nervously laughing at our own exaggerated reactions. That night, the idea of having the whole house to ourselves seemed like an exciting adventure. However, a feeling of unease began to settle in as the night progressed, a subtle tension that I couldn't fully identify. At that moment, I had no idea that this night would become one of the most terrifying of my life. Lucas and I were deeply engrossed in the movie when we heard a strange noise coming from the basement. Initially, we thought it might be a plumbing issue or perhaps an animal that had ventured inside. However, the noises continued, alternating between creaks and muffled sounds that resembled cautious footsteps. I looked at Lucas, who no longer seemed as confident as before. We decided it would be best to go down and investigate. With a flashlight in hand, we headed to the basement, trying not to think about the fear that was beginning to take hold of us. The basement door was ajar, something that, according to Lucas, never happened since his parents always kept it locked. I descended the creaky wooden stairs, feeling every fiber of my body tense. The basement was shrouded in an unsettling twilight, and the smell of mold seemed stronger than ever. When we illuminated the floor with the flashlight, we saw dirty footprints that hadn't been there before. There were overturned cans, scattered boxes, clear signs that someone had been there recently. While we were trying to process what we were seeing, we heard footsteps coming from upstairs. I exchanged a look with Lucas, and we ran back to the living room. The house seemed even quieter now, as if it were waiting. We searched the rooms, each one emptier than the last. The tension increased with every minute, and our senses were on high alert, waiting for the next sound, the next proof that we were not alone. We spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the living room, alert to any movement. Lucas was holding a knife he had grabbed from the kitchen, and I clutched the flashlight as if it were a protective talisman. It was a long and exhausting night, and when the sun finally began to rise, we felt a false sense of security. That's when we heard a muffled noise coming from Lucas's parents' room. Lucas ran there and came back pale, whispering that there was a man in the house and that he had already called the police. I didn't fully understand, but didn't have time to ask if the man had seen him. We ran to hide, staying motionless, waiting for any sign of danger or the police. When the police finally arrived, everything happened very quickly. The man had tried to open the door to Lucas's parents' room, but upon realizing no one was there, he went back to hide in the basement. The police, armed and vigilant, searched the house while Lucas and I waited in the living room, trembling with fear and anxiety. A few minutes later, one of the police officers came up from the basement with a handcuffed man. He was dirty, with torn clothes and a vacant expression in his eyes. He seemed to have spent the entire night hiding down there, waiting for the right moment to act. The police asked many questions, trying to understand how the man had entered the house. They discovered that the kitchen window was broken, probably the intruder's entry point. Lucas and I remained in shock, trying to process everything that had happened while the police ensured the house was safe. Despite the scare, no one was hurt, and the intruder didn't have time to cause any significant damage. However, the feeling of violation and fear lingered in the air. I was about 10 years old and lived in a small rural town, a place where everyone knew each other and the routine was always the same. Afternoons were spent playing ball on the dirt road, while the nights were wrapped in silence, broken only by the distant sounds of crickets and owls. My best friend, Kayla, was a girl with curly hair and an easy smile, always full of ideas for our games. One day, she invited me to sleep over at her house, an isolated farm a few kilometers from the town center. To me, it seemed like an exciting adventure, a chance to explore new horizons away from the watchful eyes of my parents. Kayla's house was large and old, surrounded by cornfields and dense forests that seemed endless. We arrived there in the late afternoon, and the sun was starting to set behind the hills. Kayla's mother welcomed us with a smile and a delicious dinner, while her father told us stories about the farm, some scary, but always entertaining. After dinner, we went up to Kayla's room, a cozy space decorated with posters of bands and family photos. We spent some time laughing and telling stories until, exhausted, we lay down to sleep. Around midnight, I was awakened by a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but soon I realized it was something else. A faint scratching, as if something was scraping the walls outside the house. I remained still, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. Kayla, beside me, was also awake, her wide eyes reflecting the same fear I felt. She asked if I had heard the strange noise. I replied yes, and without saying anything else, we got out of bed. The house was enveloped in deep darkness, and the only light came from the full moon shining outside. We followed the sounds to a window that overlooked the backyard. Outside, we saw something that made us even more scared. Footprints on the ground, leading towards the barn. Then Kayla said we needed to see what it could be. We silently went out the back door, trying not to make any noise. The air was cold, and every step seemed to echo in the night. The footprints were large, belonging to an adult, and led directly to the barn. The barn door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. I took a deep breath and looked at Kayla, who just nodded. We pushed the door and entered. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and old wood was strong. The darkness was almost total, but there was an old lantern hanging on a nail on the wall. Kayla lit it, and the light revealed the barn's interior. Piles of hay, some old tools, and at the back, a figure. At first, it seemed just a shadow, but when the lantern's light reached it, we saw it clearly. It was a man, or at least the silhouette of a man. He was standing still, looking directly at us. "Who's there?" Kayla shouted, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond, but a low, guttural sound came from his direction. Before we could do anything, the lantern's light flickered and went out, leaving us in complete darkness. A cold fear ran through my body, and I grabbed Kayla's hand, pulling her out of the barn. We ran back to the house, locking the door behind us. We spent the rest of the night awake, locked in Kayla's room, listening to the sounds coming from outside and trying to understand what had just happened. The figure in the barn, the mysterious footprints, everything seemed like a nightmare from which we couldn't wake up. While we waited, a new sound caught our attention. It wasn't a scratching or a creak from outside, but a muffled noise that seemed to come from inside the house. We exchanged nervous glances and, armed with fragile courage, decided to investigate. We slowly went down the stairs, each step creaking under our feet. The sound seemed to come from the basement, a place we always avoided because of its gloomy and damp atmosphere. When we reached the basement door, it was ajar, a detail we hadn't noticed before. Kayla grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, and I held her hand tightly as she pushed the door open, revealing the darkness below. The basement was cold and full of cobwebs. The flashlight's light flickered. The sound was clearer now. It was as if something was moving down there. Slowly, we descended the steps, each one seeming longer and narrower than the last. At the bottom of the basement, among old boxes and dust-covered furniture, we saw a familiar figure. It was Jake, Kayla's older cousin, who hadn't been to the farm in months. He was facing away from us, muttering something inaudible while rummaging through an old wooden chest. When the flashlight's light reached him, he stopped abruptly and turned around. His eyes were wide, as if he had seen something terrible. His expression was a mix of fear and confusion, and he was trembling uncontrollably. "What are you doing here, Jake?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake didn't respond immediately. His eyes darted around quickly, as if he were trying to understand something he couldn't explain. Finally, he spoke, his voice a broken whisper. "He's here. I can't let him out." Before we could ask anything else, we heard footsteps behind us. We turned quickly, but there was no one there. When we looked back at Jake, he had disappeared. The basement was silent again, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. With our hearts racing, we ran back upstairs, locking the basement door behind us. We told Kayla's parents everything as soon as it was fully daylight, but when we went back to the basement with them, there was no sign of Jake or the wooden chest. The following days were a blur of fear and uncertainty. No one could explain what had happened or where Jake could be. The farm felt different, as if it had been marked by that night of terror. In 2017, we were 14 years old, and our friendship was a refuge of laughter and shared dreams. That night, we were all gathered at Jasmine's house, a cozy place in a residential neighborhood. The plan was simple: watch horror movies until we fell asleep, surrounded by fluffy pillows and buckets of popcorn. Jasmine's house was always the perfect setting for our sleepovers. The smell of popcorn filled the living room, and the walls were decorated with movie posters and photos of our moments together. It was a typical night for teenagers, full of animated conversations and whispers about our crushes and school secrets. The lights were low, and the sound of the movie mixed with our laughter and the occasional creaking of the windows moving with the night wind. However, that night, the familiar and safe environment began to take on a more sinister tone, even before we started to notice the first signs that something was wrong. The clock was nearing midnight when a peculiar sound broke our bubble of fun. It came from upstairs, a muffled noise, like cautious footsteps on the floorboards. Initially, we thought it could be Jasmine's younger brother, Nick, trying to scare us. Amid laughs and sighs, we went upstairs, calling for him. When we reached the hallway of the bedrooms, everything was silent. "Nick, if you're trying to scare us, it's not working," Jasmine shouted, but the only response was silence. We checked each room, every corner, but there was no sign of Nick. Puzzled, but not exactly scared, we went back to the living room. A few minutes passed until the sound started again, this time coming from the kitchen. Jasmine, with a mix of bravery and irritation, decided to investigate. We followed her, forming a cautious line, feeling the adrenaline starting to pulse. The kitchen was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the window. That's when Jasmine froze in place. Her eyes were fixed on the back door, which was unlocked. A shadow quickly passed by the window, and we all jumped at the same time. The reality that something or someone was trying to get into the house hit us like a crushing weight. Jasmine quickly closed and locked the door. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and called her parents, who were out at a dinner. While we waited, the sounds didn't stop. Scratching at the door, light and quick footsteps. When the police finally arrived, the tension had reached a peak. They found signs of forced entry at the back door, but the intruder had already fled, leaving us with fear and the certainty that our safety had been violated.